Hey everyone, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky. And today I want to talk a little bit about the high-tech Idaho 4 investigation. I want to talk about the results, the benefits, and the failures of the technology that investigators used. Now, I want to start with the touch DNA that law enforcement claims that they found on a knife sheath that was next to two of the victims inside the crime scene. When investigators processed this touch DNA that they allegedly found on the button snap of this knife sheath, they ran the results through the CODIS system, which is basically a DNA database that covers everything from local all the way up to federal. So when they entered the information into this database, they didn't get any results. So what they decided to do was submit this touch DNA to a third party, basically a .com company that generates family trees from the DNA that their customers willingly submit to them. So basically, they started a profile with this .com company and submitted this DNA. It's called investigative genetic genealogy testing, and that's a mouthful, so I'm just going to say IGG, which I'm sure that you've heard if you've been following this case. Now, basically what this means is that law enforcement peeks into your personal profile without you knowing. So it's kind of sneaky. Now, what they do is they open an account. So they start a profile with this DNA sample. And from this DNA sample, they begin to build a family tree. And from that family tree, they're basically trying to narrow it down to one suspect. So, although it is clever, in my opinion, it's an invasion of your privacy. I feel like it's a gray area. I feel like the feds should not be allowed to just peek into your personal life anytime that they want without your permission. I mean, think about this. So what if somebody in your family had an affair and someone's dad wasn't really their dad? Well, that might be information that families might not want to get out. But instead, the feds are going to go in there without your knowledge and dig that up. I just don't think that's right. So they have this very minuscule touch DNA sample from the knife sheath that came from inside the house. Now, they don't know who this DNA belongs to. So now they need a match. So what they do is they follow Brian Koberger and his dad across country, 2,500 miles to Pennsylvania. They drive 2,500 miles so they can go collect a piece of DNA from one of Brian Koberger's family members. They end up finding that touch DNA in Brian Koberger's parents' garbage on a piece of trash. So basically what they do is they send that piece of trash to the lab for processing, to the IGG lab. Now, magically, it's processed within just a couple of days, and it's a match. Brian Koberger, this touch DNA that was found on the knife sheath, is a statistical match to Brian Koberger's dad's DNA, which was found in the garbage. So this is what law enforcement needed to make the arrest. So as much as they'll tell you that this touch DNA that they put through IGG isn't important and that they don't need it for court, this was a crucial piece of evidence that was used to arrest Brian Kohberger. And we'll talk about that more here in a second, because now they're not going to use that information. But make no mistake, this was the evidence that allowed them to arrest Brian Kohberger in Pennsylvania. So after Brian Kohberger is taken into custody, he submits to a cheek swab, which is also referred to as a buccal swab. So basically, he allows them to take his DNA. So they take this DNA and they compare it to the original touch DNA that was inside the King Roadhouse. And it's a match. So immediately, law enforcement puts it out there to the public. Brian Kohberger's DNA was found on this knife sheath inside the crime scene. So he must be guilty, right? His DNA was inside the crime scene. That's what I thought. When I heard about this DNA, I said, they caught this guy. This guy left his DNA inside the crime scene. Now, after I thought that, I started kind of digging into this IgG and how they went about processing this DNA. Now, the more that I researched, the more that I realized that this evidence was not as solid as they would like for us to believe. This wasn't a drop of blood that was left at the crime scene. It was a minuscule sample of touch DNA. They couldn't even process this at the federal lab, so they had to send it out to a third party. So as I'm researching this, I'm becoming more and more skeptical about this evidence. Not only am I becoming more skeptical about this touch DNA, but I'm also becoming more and more skeptical about the actual knife sheath itself. If you really think about it, this touch DNA was not found on a permanent object inside this house. It was not found on an immovable object. It was found on a knife sheath, which is meant to be carried around. So, I'm not saying that this is what happened, but it would not be difficult for somebody to place that knife sheath in the crime scene. Now, I'm not saying that's what happened, but I'm saying because of the size of this knife sheath, it could easily be transported. So, that kind of started to raise some questions. And I began to kind of wonder about the condition, the entire condition of this knife sheath. Because I always found it strange that all they found was just this one piece of touch DNA on the button snap. This crime scene was described as extremely messy. So it seems as though this knife sheath would be covered in body fluid. It was found right next to one of the victims, inside the bed. So I started to wonder, how did they extract this small piece of touch DNA? It just didn't seem on the up and up to me. So, of course, at that time, I started kind of giving the investigators the benefit of the doubt. I'm thinking this is going to come out in the hearings and it'll all make sense. So what happens when the hearings come? None of it makes sense. They decide that they're not even going to use this touch DNA evidence. So these investigators followed Brian Kohberger all the way across the country to go dig in his parents' trash to get this touch DNA, and now they're not even going to use it in court. Why? Because the manner in which they went through to process this touch DNA is not reliable. It's not reliable. So they can't use it in court. So after all of this work and basically destroying Brian Koberger's credibility and his life, telling everybody he was in the house, that was his DNA. Then they backpedal and decide they're not going to use this evidence. So now they don't have to prove how they got to these results. They basically just publicized the results and never showed their work, which that doesn't make sense. If you have this result, there's some way that you got to that result. And now they can't show the process. So that's a problem. So after investigators did all of this work to identify whose touch DNA this was on the knife sheath, they decide that they're not going to use it. And that's odd to me because this is the actual DNA that was inside the house. They compared the DNA that they took from Brian Koberger after they arrested him to this DNA. But if this DNA is unreliable, how do you compare the two? You can't really switch out the DNA sample that you took directly from Brian Koberger after you arrested him, because that's not the DNA that was inside the house. So that DNA does not connect him to the crimes at all. So it's very strange that the prosecution tried to basically switch out the DNA samples. Now, one thing about technology is that it's very effective. It's very, investigators use technology every day to solve criminal cases. But the other side of technology is that it can be manipulated. Technology can be manipulated. And we've all heard stories about law enforcement agencies who have manipulated technology in order to either create or change evidence. Now, I'm not saying that happens all the time, and I'm not saying that that's a common occurrence. Maybe it is. But it does happen. And that's why it's so important for these investigators to show the process of how they came to this result. Because you can't just give people the result and not show them the process. It becomes a situation basically where it's take our word for it. But what if we don't want to take your word for it? What if we want to see how you came to this conclusion? So law enforcement used this touch DNA to arrest Brian Koberger. But when it came time to prove how they came up with this result with the touch DNA, they walked away from it. So basically they destroyed Brian Koberger's life, and now they don't have to prove how they came to those results. In my opinion, that's shady. They basically put all this information out there, and then when it's time to prove it, they can't do that. So as far as the IgG and the touch DNA that was on the knife sheath, in my opinion, if they can't prove that in court, then it's a non-factor. It doesn't even matter. It's like it didn't even exist. But if it doesn't exist, then law enforcement has no connection to Brian Koberger as far as him being inside the house. Without the touch DNA, they have nothing that connects him to the crime scene other than this video footage that investigators believe they have of Brian Koberger driving his Hyundai Elantra around the King Roadhouse repeatedly. So law enforcement came out and said that along with the touch DNA, they also had video of Brian Koberger's car driving around the King Roadhouse. They also claim that they have cellular tower information that would also put Bryan Kohberger's phone in the same area. So basically, they're using the video and the cellular data together to basically map out where Bryan Kohberger was driving that evening. Well, not only that evening, they also say that he had been around the King Roadhouse up to 12 times. So they come out and they tell the public that they have Bryan Kohberger's car on video and that his cellular phone data backs that up. So they know that he was around the crime scene. Now, we haven't seen any of this footage. We've never seen a clear video. We've never seen a clear photo. And we've never seen any cellular data information that would back up the claims of investigators. So basically, when it comes to time for when it becomes time for the investigators to prove this information, because they've already released the results to the public. Bryan Kohberger was driving around the King Roadhouse in his white four-door Hyundai Elantra. That's what they came out and said. So, of course, now people are thinking, okay, his touch DNA is inside the house, and now investigators have video and cellular data that proves that he was driving around this house. The only problem is they don't have the proof. They have, they talk about how they followed him. It almost sounds like they were following him around in real time. And then they release this map in the PCA that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It basically looks like Bryan Kohberger drove way out of his way, was going a ton of different directions, and somehow ended up at the King Roadhouse. It doesn't make sense. The map in the PCA does not make sense. So, again, they're not able to show their work. When Ann Taylor begins asking investigators how they came to these results that Bryan Kohberger was driving around this house, they basically say, we have him on video. We also have his cellular phone data. That's how we know. So Ann Taylor says, okay, show me. Show me this video. Show me this cellular phone data. And investigators cannot show the defense any of the process. So, that starts to get shady. You're giving the end result. You're saying we have him on video. We have his cell phone data. But then you're not able to prove that. So what good is that technology if you put it all together and then when you get to court, you can't even show your work? You can't prove your allegations. So now you can't prove your touch DNA allegations, and you can't prove that it was actually Bryan Kohberger on any of this video footage. And you don't even have the cellular tower information. So out of these, two pieces of technological evidence, digital evidence, all that the prosecution has is the end result. They don't have the work. They should have this. These are experienced detectives, allegedly. So as these detectives are processing all of this evidence, they would know that this is digital evidence. You have to provide more than just the end result. because people know that technology can be manipulated. So we want to see the process. We want to see how you did it. And if it's on the up and up, law enforcement and the prosecution should be able to lay it all out in an easy to understand package so that we can understand how they came to these conclusions. But they can't do that. And in my opinion, that's shady. Now, here's another problem when it comes to the digital evidence that the prosecution claims to have, but can't provide. Basically, in order to secure an indictment, the prosecution would have had to present proof to the grand jury. And it's the grand jury's responsibility to verify this information. So how did the prosecution secure an indictment from the grand jury with the evidence that they don't have? Bill Thompson basically stated in court, we do not have any more evidence. We don't have any more information. So how did they get that indictment from the grand jury with the information that they had, that they've supposedly turned over to the defense? Now, Ann Taylor is saying there's nothing in any of this. There's nothing in this evidence that, shows me my client is guilty. So how did they secure that indictment with that information? Or did they give the grand jury evidence that they haven't turned over to the defense? Either way, however you look at this, all of the prosecution's evidence has an asterisk next to it. They don't just have solid evidence that you can look at and it all makes sense. It's a mess. It's all over the place. The state has some, the FBI has some, the judge now has some. So this evidence is everywhere. It's not well organized, and a lot of it's missing. This is a big case. This is a quadruple homicide with the death penalty on the table. You would think that this prosecution, after using all of this technology, would have all of their ducks in a row. But they don't. It doesn't appear that they do. They look very unorganized, in my opinion. And it looks like they don't have the evidence that they've been claiming to have this whole time. So when they secured this indictment and they secured these warrants, were they in possession of this evidence? Or did they not even have the evidence? There were multiple agencies that worked on this case, and they all seem to have a little piece of this evidence. So it's basically easy for the prosecution to say, well, it's their fault. It's their fault that we don't have it. But really, it's not. It's been almost 2 years, and this prosecution has had plenty of time to get this case together, to get their evidence together. But even with all of the technology, this is cutting edge technology. Even with all of this cutting edge technology, they really still have nothing. The defense has no evidence that shows them why Bryan Kohberger was arrested. So with all of this technology, the prosecution still doesn't have solid evidence. And that's a problem. So we'll see if Bill Thompson is able to provide any proof. Because without proof, it's all just talk. If you can't show the process, or if you can't prove your allegations, then what do you have? You really have nothing. And that's what Ann Taylor and the defense have been saying this whole time, is that where is all of this evidence? Where's all the evidence that you have? You know, Bill Thompson, like I said, was standing up there confident. We have this guy. This is our guy. You're just going to have to trust the process. But right now, it really doesn't look like that process is working for Bill Thompson. So now, with all of this technology, there's still no cut and dry evidence that proves that Bryan Kohberger was involved in these crimes. Will we see that evidence? It's hard to tell. It hasn't come out in discovery. You know, Ann Taylor should have seen this evidence by now, but she hasn't. So either the prosecution is playing games, or they simply do not have this evidence. They don't have proof of their claims. As of right now, this technology looks like a failure. It almost is going to benefit the defense more than it does the prosecution. Thanks for hanging out with me today. I really do appreciate it. And if you liked my video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel. Like I said, I really do appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.